We are very lucky today to be welcoming Karen Adolph to speak with us. Dr. Adolph is currently the Julius Silver Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at NYU, but she has her PhD from Emory, so I guess it's okay. Yeah. So broadly speaking, and in more or less her own words, her research focuses on behavioral flexibility, how infants, children, and adults adapt to novel and challenging situations. So in addition to the Julius Silver Professorship, Karen recently received the Kurt Kafka Medal for worldwide outstanding work on infants' perception, action, development, and has served as the president of the International Congress of Infant Studies, among many other awards and honors. Her CV lists 172 publications, which recently includes journals such as Current Biology, Child Development, Developmental Psychology, and Trends in Cognitive Science. So she's also a very prolific speaker, and despite having umpteen million other sorts of engagements this fall, has been kind enough to come speak with us. And not only that, but prepare our own bespoke lecture on how behavior develops, perceiving, planning, and acting. So please join me in welcoming Karen Adolph.
Hey. So you guys, basically, I am interested in two things: behavior and development. And development has to be of something. So I study behavior because you can see it and measure it directly. The bottom line of this whole thing today is going to be that behavior develops through perceiving, planning, and acting. And one of the coolest things about behavior is that it unfolds over multiple nested timescales. You can analyze it in real time, like in milliseconds or in seconds, or over longer time spans, like learning. So there's days and weeks and months. And video, as you can see, is a really powerful and widely accessible and inexpensive tool for capturing behavior in context so that you can understand how behavior is unfolding over time. So why focus on behavior? Because it is everything that we do. It's why we have brains, and it's why we have bodies. And for animals and for human infants, behavior is the clearest window that researchers have into perception or cognition and other psychological processes. And in the beautiful words of your own Dietrich Stout, he wrote that intelligent behavior emerges bottom up in real time and over development from perceptual motor coordination in the real world. So all of the important action is not in the mind. Sure, artificial intelligence, like a computer, has more computational power than, say, even a chess grandmaster. But real behavior is still unmatched by the very best AI. So here you see Kasparov, who is seeing and doing as well as knowing. He's moving his eyes to look at the chessboard, and he's moving his arms to move the chess pieces. The computer, Deep Blue here, can't do any of that. And then here's another guy who's typing in the location of Kasparov's chess pieces to tell Deep Blue. And then he's translating the computer's, thoughts into actions to move Deep Blue's pieces. And, here's Deep Blue just sitting there running his computations. RoboCup is the new AI challenge. And the ultimate goal of this thing is to build a team of humanoid robots that can beat the World Cup champions. So robots are still a long way from winning against a human soccer player. Looking, of course, is a really important behavior. And looking time studies are the most popular paradigm for studies of infant cognition. But looking time doesn't tell researchers anything about the input for learning or development. And looking at a flat screen is a really, really poor example of all the things that infants can do. The average 18-month-old toddler can run circles around the world's most sophisticated robots, or in this case, around their caregiver. By 18 months, most babies can walk, of course, but they can also detect changes in the environment and changing affordances for action. And they can modify their ongoing actions to cope with variations in the environment, like taking shorter, slower steps. And they can find alternative means to achieve their goals. Infant intelligence is about learning to cope with a changing body, with changing skills in a changing world. And this is something that right now only biological systems can do. So let's start with behavior at very short time scales, because the real time of milliseconds and minutes is how behavior is actually planned and controlled. In a varied environment, you need to use perception to plan and guide your motor actions. So for example, in this experiment, the infants had to decide whether to walk across wide or narrow bridges. The bridges were continually adjustable, so they could be really wide, where they were perfectly safe and really easy to walk across, or they could be more challenging, where they require gait modifications, like walking slower or taking smaller steps, turning sideways, or the bridges could be so narrow that walking was impossible. This graph shows that infants do perceive whether bridges are safe for walking. 0 here is the narrowest bridge that each baby could walk over. So this is their walking threshold, and the data are normalized to each infant's abilities. So positive numbers mean they're safe bridges. They're wider than the threshold, and there's a 50-centimeter bridge that's really wide, like an infant sidewalk or something. And there's negative numbers are representing risky bridges. So they're narrower than the baby's threshold. And there's a 2-centimeter bridge that's really, really narrow. That's like walking over a tightrope. Infants' decisions are scaled to the bridge width. That's what you're seeing with these data. They're attempting to walk across safe bridges, but refusing to walk across risky ones. That means that they can perceive possibilities for action. Moreover, they modify their steps to walk across narrow bridges. So they take more time to walk across narrower bridges, and they take more tiny little steps to make their way across the narrower bridges. And I'll show you what this looks like. So on wide bridges, the babies just ran straight across, but on narrow bridges, they inch their way slowly, and they take a lot of tiny little steps, and they turn their bodies sideways to minimize their step width. How did they know what to do? Well, they generate perceptual information by exploring the bridges. So babies hesitate longer before walking over the narrower, more challenging bridges, and they touch bridges with their feet to explore whether they can squeeze their body onto the bridge. And they touch the most on the most ambiguous bridges that are right around their threshold. In real time, infants are gathering visual information as they approach an obstacle, like a narrow bridge. So they slow down as they're approaching the bridge, and then they stop and explore at the edge and decide whether they should cross, and then if so, how they should get their way across. This is the timeline of that 30-second video clip I just showed you. So all the stuff on the left is the exploratory activity before the baby goes onto the bridge. And now I'm zooming in. The bars at the top show infants' proximity to the bridge. Each darker bar means the baby is 15 centimeters closer to the edge of the bridge. The really dark line means that baby's standing with his feet like right at the edge of the bridge. The blue bar is touching the bridge. So that's exploratory touching. And all these other different colors are where this infant is directing his gaze. So babies begin walking right away. They're just moving. As soon as the trial starts, the screen opens, the babies are in motion. They're already looking at the final destination on the landing platform. So they're only seeing the bridge in the periphery of their field of view. But on narrower bridges, that incidental information that you sort of get for free because your eyes are like in the middle of your face and your eyes are open. And so you can just see the stuff that's ahead of you. That incidental visual information prompts visual attention to the bridge from a distance. By now, the baby's really close to the edge, 15 centimeters away. And when they reach the edge of the bridge, if they're still uncertain, then they'll engage in more costly forms of exploration, like exploratory touching or additional looking. And then after gathering perceptual information, they can decide whether or how to cross. So real-time exploration sort of ramps up. And we saw this kind of orderly, systematic, sequential ramping up process in the whole sample of 14-month-old infants, where less costly forms of information gathering, like just incidental visual information and the periphery of their field of view, can instigate more costly forms of information gathering, like deliberately directing their gaze at the bridge or engaging in exploratory touching. Look, it takes a baby 7 seconds on average to go from the beginning of the starting platform till their feet are touching the bridge on a 60-centimeter bridge where they're going to run straight across. 7 seconds is a really, really long time to gather information and have your brain process it, right? So they have loads of time to gather visual information from their field of view as they're approaching the obstacle. But what about manual actions? Because manual actions are much faster than locomotion, and you don't get information for free from the peripheral vision from a distance as you're approaching a target. With a manual action, you've got to get your eyes on the target right away, or the action is already over. You have that long, not 7 seconds. So here's how we studied it. When adults use a hammer and the handle is pointing toward their dominant hand, a habitual overhand grip leads to efficient tool use. But if the handle is pointing toward their non-dominant hand, then the habitual overhand grip is no good. You've got to use an underhand grip that will lead to efficient, comfortable tool use, right? So underhand initial grip, flip your hand over, and now you can pound a peg. Young children are great in the habitual overhand condition, but they are not so great in the non-habitual condition where they need to plan their future actions by switching to an underhand initial grip. So they know that they're in an awkward position to actually use the hammer, but they're not incorporating the final action into their initial plan for how to get their hand on the handle. Somewhere between 3.5 and 5. So if the handle is pointing to the non-dominant hand, you need a non-habitual underhand grip. It's not like this thing is harder. It's just not your habitual way of doing it, right? To hammer efficiently. And if you use your habitual overhand grip, like that child did in the video, then your hand is in a really icky, awkward, inefficient position to hammer. Adults nearly uniformly use an adaptive underhand grip. Some children also do. They look just like the adults, but many children do not. And some of these non-adaptive children on the right are switching between habitual and non-habitual grips across trials. So, and there's some of them that never use a habitual, a non-habitual underhand grip, but some of them sometimes do. The adaptive children were older, the non-adaptive children were younger, but this is behavior at the level of development at months and years. And what is up with these guys who seem to know on some trials that they need to change their grips? Well, third-person video gives some clues about what's happening in real time, about whether the adaptive and non-adaptive children's underhand grips are really the same thing. It turns out that on many trials, when the non-adaptive children used an underhand grip, they changed the trajectory of their movement at the last moment. So they started out with habitual grip, and then maybe look at the bottom, and then then had to flip their hand over. So they start out doing the wrong thing, and then too late are gathering information that's guiding their future actions. So even when the non-adaptive children used underhand grips, they began their planning too late. Here's the experimental setup. To drill down to real-time processes, we used several simultaneous recording methods. We used head-mounted eye tracking to record where the participants were looking. We used wireless EEG to record neural differentiation, and we used a motion tracker to record their hand trajectories. All the recording devices were synchronized with a robotic screen that allowed us to control the exact moment when the hammer became visible, so they could see which way the handle was pointing. And the participants' hands always started in the same spot. And then after the screen opened, they could see the hammer, and they could grasp it, and they could pound the peg. And there was third-person video. They captured the entire scene from 3 camera views. And it looks like that. So all the participants, adults, and these 3 to 5-year-old children had non-habitual trials like these, where an underhand grip was most efficient. And those were interspersed with habitual trials where the overhand grip was most efficient. The head-mounted eye tracking recordings revealed what information the participants gathered and when. Each symbol on this graph is one participant's average over their non-habitual trials. The hammer here, right, is the most informative and most predictive thing in the scene for planning a future action. So the data are showing the latency to the first fixation on the hammer after the screen open, like how fast before you get your eyes on the target. The adults are the fastest to look at the hammer, then the adaptive children, and the non-adaptive children are the slowest to gather the information about the orientation of the hammer. From the moment the screen lifted until movement onset, adults are keeping their eyes on the prize, like all their visual attention is focused on the hammer. For the adaptive children, their visual attention was more dispersed, but their hotspot is still the hammer. The non-adaptive children are just looking all over the place. Okay, after gathering visual information, now they need to process the information. So we used EEG to index whether and when participants differentiated the orientation of the hammer. This graph shows the difference in readiness potential between the habitual and the non-habitual conditions. Readiness potential is a neural correlate of action planning. The dashed line shows movement onset. That's when their hand starts to move. The solid line is the average onset of neural differentiation. That's the first evidence that this person's brain is registering a difference between the 2 orientations of the hammer. And light gray means there's a significant difference between the conditions. So adults are differentiating the orientation of the hammer almost immediately, long before their hand starts to move. Like the adults, adaptive children also differentiated the orientation of the hammer before their hand began moving, but it happens much later in the game compared to adults. And non-adaptive children never differentiate the orientation of the hammer. We used a motion tracker to record the trajectory of the arm when the participants first began moving. The difference in the movement trajectories between the habitual and the non-habitual conditions begins earlier in adults compared to the adaptive children, and it never differentiates in these non-adaptive children. So planning is a real-time cascade of perceptual, neural, and motor events. The x-axis here is the time from the moment the screen opens, and this is in milliseconds. This is really super fast. Adults were the earliest to fixate the hammer. Non-adaptive children fixated the last. Adults showed earlier neural differentiation of the handle orientation compared to the adaptive children. The non-adaptive children never showed neural differentiation. The adults began moving their hand sooner than the children did. And the adults showed earlier differentiation of their movement trajectories compared to the adaptive children. The non-adaptive children showed no movement differentiation at all. So from a real-time perspective, where, all things being equal, when grasping a tool, children and adults use a habitual overhand grip. But that habitual solution doesn't work for every situation. Sometimes you need to adapt your actions to decide whether, should I just keep doing the same old thing, whether that's good enough. Children need sufficient time to gather and process perceptual information. So it's like there's a tug of war between perception and action that determines children's cognitive ability to adapt. Flexible, adaptive behaviors like these, it develops. What are children learning? They're learning to gather perceptual information so they can plan and guide their actions. Exploratory movements generate information for perception, but you need to know to gather the information. You need to know to explore. So it's a sort of planning to plan. In locomotion, the movements are big and they're slow, and generally obstacles are at a distance, so you can see them from the periphery of your field of view. There's plenty of time to modify gait and gather additional perceptual information. It takes 7 seconds to walk from the beginning of the starting platform to the widest 60-centimeter bridge. It takes 26 seconds on average for narrower bridges. That is loads and loads of time. But looking before you reach is a different problem because manual actions are small, they're fast, and the targets are they're all just close by. So you have to get your eyes on the target before your hand starts to move. You only have milliseconds to plan to get your eyes on the prize. And then you still have to differentiate the situation and plan whether you need further exploratory or different performatory actions. Infants are learning in the context of development. The input for learning depends on the immediate developmental context. It depends on infants' access to the environment. Infants' growth is dramatic and it's episodic. Michelle Lample, who is in anthropology here, famously showed that babies can grow up to 2 centimeters in a single day. Infants' motor skills also change dramatically, especially for posture and locomotion. How children can move affects their potential access to the environment. It affects what they see and what they touch and where they go. It affects their visual, manual, and whole body access to the environment. As behavior develops, the environment is also developing. These two things are developing in tandem. A nice example is the transition from crawling to walking, because walking literally brings more of the world into view. Walking gives infants a better vantage point because of how the head connects to the torso. While crawling, the head naturally points down, but while walking, the head naturally points forward. For crawlers to position their head forward, they have to crank their heads up as far as their neck can go. They have to fully extend their neck. This is a crawling infant's view of the world. While crawling, infants' heads point down, not forward. So while crawling, infants are seeing mostly the floor right in front of their hands. But in a walking posture, the entire room is visible. Currently, we are precisely quantifying infants' changing environment and changing opportunities for learning. So we're testing how growth of infants' bodies and skills changes their visual, manual, and whole body access to the environment. The study is longitudinal. Babies come to the lab every month from 2 months to 18 months of age. At the 2-month visit, they're basically stuck flat on their backs, but at 18 months, they're experts at running around. We use computer vision and machine learning to track infants' location, their posture, and their field of view. It's all video based. There's nothing on the baby. So all the analyses are based only on third-person video. And it yields a changing portrait of which pixels in the room, which tiny little areas of the room are, touched, are accessed, and by which perceptual systems. So we get a time series of every input to infants' perceptual system, and we get the accumulated duration for each perceptual system. So this is a video of what the playroom looks like. This is a beautiful, rich, large play space. It's filled with varied surfaces and objects. On the walls, there's pictures and activity centers and a wall of toys. On the ground, there's different surfaces that vary in friction and rigidity. On the ceiling, there's lights and cameras and beams. The room is filled with cool toys to play with. And there's a big barrier that occludes view of half the room. We put babies down on their backs on this gridded foam mat. The caregiver sits in a chair and is occupied on their phone. And then babies have 10 minutes to do whatever they want. At 2 months, the babies can't even get off their backs. By 18 months, they can access this environment with their eyes, with their hands, and with their whole bodies, so they can get up and go. We have 8 camera views to ensure that the infant is always visible on at least 2 cameras. Here I've zoomed into 1 camera view so you can see what's happening. This exemplar is 8 seconds from one, typical walking infant's 10-minute video. So the baby starts out upright, playing with this green alligator activity center, and then walks across the room to play with that little pink pig. Using computer vision, we locate the baby in each camera view and do 3D pose estimation. Then we render the room in 3 dimensions. We do this so we can manipulate the room to see it from every angle at every moment. And the analyses are tied to these visualizations. So what infants are seeing and touching with their hands or with their bodies is inserted into this rendering so that we can see exactly what's happening at every moment and from every angle. Based on pose estimation of the head orientation, we can draw a cone from the baby's face until it hits a solid surface like the ceiling or the wall or the floor. And then we can quantify how much of that surface is visually touched, is accessed, and every object that got touched inside of that visual cone. Here's a history of visual access for that same 8 seconds. So you get tons and tons of data. Using these computer vision tools, we can precisely quantify the amount, the history, the time series of visual, manual, and whole body access at every time point. And we can do all of this with no recording device on the baby. Behavior develops in a changing body with changing skills in a changing world. Infants' bodies and skills constrain their interactions with the environment, and it also filters information from the environment. The world's really not a buzzing, blooming confusion because they're not getting the whole world. They're just getting the part of the world that they can actually process and manage. Because babies' bodies and skills develop, the environment also develops. And as Gomez Marin and Ganzafar put it in their beautiful paper that they entitled The Life of Behavior, they wrote, all animals share a common world, but not all animals have a world in common. What drives improvements in behavior? Practice. What kind of practice? Immense amounts of time-distributed variable practice. This graph shows the accumulated number of steps per hour plotted against days of walking. Each symbol is one baby's spontaneous walking in a lab playroom that's set up with toys and elevations. Babies walk a lot, so toddlers average 2,400 steps per hour. That's like 14,000 steps per day. We see the same thing in new samples of infants tested in the lab playroom that's set up with different toys and different elevations and different configurations. We see the same thing when we record infants walking around in their homes, and we see the same things, new studies of infants' natural activity in their homes. The practice is time distributed. This isn't like a death march. It's not like practicing on a motorized treadmill. This figure is showing timelines of walking bouts for 60 infants over 30 minutes of spontaneous walking. Each row is one baby. The little bursts of black are the time when the infants are walking. So they move in these little bursts of activity that are separated by longer periods of rest. Practice is about starting and stopping. It's not continual stepping. Look at this baby's right leg. She's just standing there and then takes a step. That's the whole walking bout. That's it. And that's a whole lot of what babies do. Short bouts are common across development. More than 30% of infants' bouts have only 1 or 2 or 3 steps in them. So babies can take longer bouts, and they often do, but a lot of the time it's only 1 or 2 or 3 step bouts. Their practice is variable. Relatively few of their walking paths are straight, 25%. 75% are curved. They're walking these curvy, varied paths. And it's true across development. You see curved paths in brand new walkers. You see curved paths in experienced walkers 9 months later. Their step direction is variable. Most of their bouts contain steps that are not forward. Their steps are in every direction, forward, sideways, and backward. I'm going to play it at half speed so you can see what I mean. This baby takes 1, 2 sideways steps, then 1, 2, 3 forward steps, and then 1, 2, 3 backward steps. Less than 20% of bouts are only forward steps. Most bouts have a mixture of forward and not forward steps, like you just saw, or there's no forward steps at all. And it's true.
Sorry. Practice for what? To ultimately become adult walker, or what is this practice for?
From the baby's point of view, it's for nothing. From the baby's point of view, and I'm going to do that in the next section. Why are they moving at all? Well, I don't think babies are like, oh, I really need to gain my skills so I could be like an adult walker. No,
But
no.
But why is the organism doing this? Is it so it can become?
Okay, hold on, because I have a whole section on that. You with me? All right.
Yeah.
Practice is very imperfect. Behavior is fallible. When adults fall, this is a really high impact error, especially in older adults. And so our common sense, would suggest that errors shape learning and that negative reward shapes learning. But babies fall all the time. Their walking is filled with errors. Babies fall while they're playing. They trip over their own feet. Babies fall when they try to sit down. Babies fall when they try to stand back up. Babies fall all the time. On average, infants fall 40 times for each hour that they're in locomotion. Falling is part of their daily life. It's a substantial part of their natural input for learning to move. They fall a lot, but the infants don't care, and their parents don't care. Their everyday falls are so trivial that infants rarely fuss, and their caregivers rarely show concern. 91% of falls, that's that long green bar, they're uneventful and they largely go unmarked. Infants are back at play right away. So even after a big fall, this baby is back at play within 3 seconds. On average, infants recover from their falls within 2 seconds. And infants don't decrease their walking or stay away from the objects or the places in the room that were associated with their falls. This baby fell 15 times with this pink stroller in 20 minutes of free play. But the falls didn't discourage her from playing with the stroller. Across babies, they walked just as much after each fall as they had done before they fell. A really important factor that mitigates the impact of falling is the size and shape and composition of infants' bodies. So infants are short and they're low to the ground and they're padded with baby fat and they move slowly. It's like they're built to fall. The potential energy that's generated by an infant fall is 18 times less than if infants were adult-sized and walked at adult speeds. The natural input for learning, it's truly immense amounts of time-distributed variable practice during everyday activity. Their practice is imperfect, they're very fallible, but that's okay because the errors are generally trivial. They're trivial, and that means that infants are not discouraged by falling from obtaining immense amounts of practice. A system that allows for frequent, low-impact errors encourages beginners to keep practicing to the point of mastery. All right, what motivates babies to get all that practice? Why do they move? A common sense hypothesis is that infants move to go to the people or places or things that they see. So to study whether where infants look influences where they go, we fitted them with head-mounted eye traps. Infants really move to go to a destination, then they should look at something while they're stationary and then go to it. Like this stationary infant sees that ball on that green block and then just walks straight toward it. It turns out these kind of destination-directed bouts are pretty rare. 18% of the time infants move. Also possible that infants discover something while they're traveling. So in a discovery bout, infants would start out looking at, whatever, like maybe this yellow saxophone, and then keep walking and see something else like this green alligator. And then that becomes like a sort of found destination. But discovery bouts are also pretty rare. What's happening the rest of the time? Well, the stationary infant is looking all over and then just starts moving and continues looking all over and then just stops moving in the middle of the floor, beyond arm's reach of any recognizable person or place or thing. Most of babies' bouts don't involve a destination at all. They're not going toward any recognizable destination. Okay, that was really surprising to us. And so we figured if it were really true that you don't even need objects to instigate locomotion, then babies should move just as much in a totally empty room as in a room that's filled with toys. So we tested infants playing in a room filled with toys. There were actually toys that are designed to elicit locomotion. And we compared their locomotor activity to infants in the same room with all the stuff removed. We find infants walk just as much in an empty room as in a room filled with toys. So they spend the same amount of time in motion. They take the same number of steps per hour. They travel the same distance per hour. And infants in both conditions go to the same low percentage of destinations, only about 30%. In the toy room, the infants mostly went to toys. In the empty room, infants went to their caregiver or features of the room, like doorknobs or walls or like bits of fluff on the floor, on the carpet. Most of the time, like 70% of the time on average, the babies are just walking around, running around. So what differs, infants in the toy room spend less time near their caregiver. She's no longer the best thing in the room, right? And infants in the toy room explore more of the playroom. So they visit more of the open area. And the differences are really clear when you look at individual infants' paths. These are paths from one infant in the toy room and one infant in the no toy room. The black dot is the caregiver. She's just sitting on a chair on her cell phone, filling out forms. The two babies took a similar number of steps, but they covered really different amounts of area. Infants in the toy room travel all over. Infants in the no toy room repeat their paths. Here's all of the babies' paths ordered by the amount of area that they covered. Infants in the toy-filled room cover more area in the same amount of steps. So movement achieves goals, but it's also its own reward. Infants are learning to move in a physical environment that is filled with stuff. And of course, sometimes they move to goals, but they also move spontaneously with no goal in sight and no goal presumably in mind. Regardless, all of that movement leads to enhanced opportunities for learning, at least learning to walk and probably learning lots of other cool things. And it definitely leads to improvements in walking skill. All right, baby's natural practice regimen supports behavioral development. For example, to test whether all that kind of crazy walking is really a good way to learn to walk, we taught simulated robots to walk using real infant data. This is a simulated robot in Peter Stone's lab being trained to walk along different kinds of paths. And then the success of the training is evaluated with robot soccer. Why is soccer? Because soccer is kind of like real life. It's unpredictable, there's novelty, there's variability, there's other active agents who themselves have goals. In tournament 1, we asked how training robots on geometric paths would compare to training robots on real baby paths. Before Peter Stone came along, training in a straight line was the most popular way to train robots to walk, and that is the most popular intervention for babies with disabilities. The short answer, babies win. Across 1,000 matches between each pair of teams, babies show the largest average goal difference. In tournament 2, we used machine learning to cluster 75 infants' paths into 5 groups based on the variability of their walking in terms of the path shape or the direction or the path length, the number of starts and stops. So all the kind of variables I was showing you, the purple team was the most varied across the measures. And tournament 2 shows that more varied experience leads to better functional consequences. It leads to more wins in 1,000 head-to-head matches of RoboCup. And when we model different penalties for falling with simulated robots, 0 penalty, no penalty at all leads to the greatest transfer and flexibility. Why is that? Because I think skills that require vast creativity and generativity and flexibility, skills like walking, it's best if there's no penalty for errors in early stages of learning so that making mistakes doesn't stop infants from trying. So it is possible to test formal models that are embodied, embedded, and enculturated, just like with real animals and real babies. Our simulated robots suggest that infants' natural training regimen is optimal for learning, and immense amounts of time-distributed varied practice leads to flexible, functional behavior. Errors for babies, like falling, are discounted. They're not treated like a negative reward. So infants are not dissuaded from practicing their new skills to the point of mastery. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. When you train the robots with no penalty for falling, did they stop falling at some point, or did the rate of falling like diminish as they practice more and more?
The rate of falling does diminish in the robots, but it's so we compared the standard robot penalty to half of that, or to 0, or to double that, or 10 times that, or 100 times that. And the higher the penalty, the worse was being able to get through their own path that they trained on with minimizing the number of falls. And so the outcome measures were like the distance the robot could travel. So every time the robot falls, these are simulated robots. That's why I was kind of rolling my eyes thinking like, how to explain this. Every time they fall, it stops the program so they can only travel a shorter distance, right? So the higher the penalty, the worse they are on the paths that they trained on. But also, the higher the penalty, the worse they are on untrained paths, on other babies' path sets. So basically, zero penalty leads to the greatest learning on the path that they had trained on when they're tested on the same path. And zero penalty leads to the greatest transfer and flexibility to untrained paths. Okay. And this is my final thing, is just a really quick pitch for open video sharing. And that is where Databrary comes in. Databrary is a web-based library for research videos. That's why we call it Databrary. It's designed for the secure, ethical, open sharing of research video. Video uniquely demonstrates procedures and findings. This whole presentation basically was using video as demonstration. You can see for yourself exactly what the researchers did and how the participants responded, and that's going to increase research transparency and reproducibility. Video as data is uniquely suited for reuse. So you can ask questions that go beyond the scope of the original study, questions the original researchers had maybe never even imagined. And Databrary will manage and preserve your videos indefinitely. As of a couple days ago, Databrary had around 1,600 authorized investigators from 725 institutions around the globe and was serving up 100,000 hours of shared video. To capitalize on the richness of video, you need tools. So we created the Data View tool. This is software that you can download to your computer. It's offered free and openly to researchers. There's free tech support. There's actually free consultation. And you can use machine learning to annotate video, like to track people's movements or to pick out objects in the scene. So what are the benefits of video recording, video annotation, video sharing, and video reuse? I think it's huge. I think it's increased transparency and reproducibility and the possibility of speeding up scientific progress. So please go register on Databrary. Emory is already an authorized institution. You'll get authorized within probably 24 hours. Sum up. How does behavior develop? Infants acquire flexible, functional behavior from immense amounts of time-distributed, variable, imperfect practice during everyday activity with a changing body and changing skills in a changing world. Basically, infants are learning to learn. That means they're learning how to generate the requisite perceptual information from moment to moment that specifies which behaviors they can do and how to do them. Or, as Dietz put it, intelligent behavior emerges bottom up in real time and over development from perceptual motor coordination in the real world. Finally, as a science, we have the paradigms, the tools, the technology, and the infrastructure to really understand behavior and its development. We've just got to do it. That's it. Thank you.